Hey everybody. Last week I published my first video in a series where I am reading through Trent Horn's Answering Atheism. In that introductory video, I only covered part 1 of Answering Atheism, which only covers the first 2 chapters of the book. In today's video, I'm covering part 2, titled Should I Be an Atheist?, which covers 5 chapters. In an effort to be brief, I'm going to try to make this video less than 15 minutes, but as always, if somebody thinks that I'm being unfair to Trent Horn, or really I'm just being unfair in general, please reach out to me and I would love to have you on the channel to dialogue. With that, let's jump into the book. Part 2 of Trent Horn's 2013 book Answering Atheism is called Should I Be an Atheist? It covers 5 chapters and starts on chapter 3. And we start off on a point of agreement even. Trent Horn calls back to a debate between William Lane Craig and somebody who I don't know, and the person who I don't know was insisting that there's no evidence for God. I don't agree. I think that there is some evidence. I just don't think there is sufficient evidence, hence why I'm an agnostic. But point of agreement, so great. We quickly do get to a point of disagreement, though. At the bottom of the first page of Part 2, Chapter 3 is Atheism True, Trent Horn has a section called Beyond the Reach of Science. The existence of other minds is not proven by direct scientific evidence alone. The mind, which is a collection of immaterial thoughts, cannot be observed like the brain, which is the 3-pound lump of tissue that resides in your skull, though observing the brain will require surgery or dissection. So, yeah, I mean, Trent's right. But what's funny is Trent just kind of, assumes that, well, we all believe in minds, right? And, if minds exist, then there should be things that we do believe without having empirical evidence of that thing, and maybe God is such a thing. Look, and he never actually says that. Look at right here. He just jumps straight into morality as an example of something else that, we can't actually measure using the scientific method, but we should believe it anyway, right? Well, not so fast, Trent. The existence of other minds is not something that the scientific community actually thinks exists. So this is an article by a PhD named Dr. Lazarus, published in Psychology Today. And what's funny is that this article is actually kind of pro concept of minds, but it upfront admits the prevailing consensus in neuroscience is that consciousness is an emergent property of brains and its metabolism. When the brain dies, the mind and consciousness of the being to whom the brain belonged cease to exist. In other words, without a brain, there can be no consciousness. Link to this whole article in the description down below. It seems to be using mind and consciousness in the same way, but Trent just kind of asserts that, oh yeah, minds totally, we're all on the same page, right? Minds exist. Not so fast. We're not all on the same page. I don't think that minds exist, and the broad scientific community at large seems to also agree that minds do not exist, at least not minds in the way that Trent has in mind. So he just tries to smuggle that in there, and I just kind of wanted to, hey, not so fast. And it's funny that there's no mention of this in this book. That happens a lot in this book, actually, so far, where Trent just kind of assumes that we're all on the same page, and we're not. And I think that's a problem. He says the existence of moral truths cannot be proven scientifically, and then there's kind of this assumption that oh, hey, but we're all on the same page, right? No, we're not all on the same page. I'm a moral anti-realist. And then he goes, the existence of abstract objects cannot be proven scientifically. I don't think that abstract objects exist either. So if nothing else, hopefully Trent Horn would find me consistent, I hope. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out. It's we're 0 for 3. We're 0 for 3 right now in terms of chapter 3. I highlighted a universe that looks godless in green because I more or less agreed with this section. See, my stance on God is that whatever God would be if God existed is just so outside the bounds of what we could possibly understand, is that I have no idea what a godded universe and a godless universe would look like. It's just, ask an ant what a humanless universe would look like, or if a human the ant will have no idea what you're talking about, obviously, and the distance between God and us is even greater than the distance between us and ants. So I have no idea what I would even look for to like prove that a God exists or doesn't exist. So like a godless universe, I have no idea. Like all I can do is kind of throw my arms up at that. Um, and Trent kind of makes the same point twice: a planet that looks godless versus a universe that looks godless. That's all well and good. Yeah, I leave this note down here saying I largely agree, since if God existed, I think he would be entirely unknowable to us. How much about humans do bacteria understand, and the difference between us and God would be even greater. Um, Trent says something here that actually kind of came up in like a debate that I did somewhat recently, proving a negative. Trent says it is possible to disprove the existence of some beings. I would say that the proposition that Santa Claus exists is false. Okay, cool. I kind of make this argument in the debate that I did with Dave Pullman over on Kyle Whittington's channel, where I'm arguing that I do think that the 100 years of the Gospels being treated anonymously is evidence that the Gospels didn't have their names attached to them. And I think it's kind of funny that Trent Horn kind of agrees with me here. Now, Trent might point to some, I don't know Trent's views on the authorship of the Gospels. Maybe Trent says something to the effect of like, well, Santa Claus doesn't have his own Papias. And like, very well, if your whole argument hinges on Papias, great. That's a discussion for another video. Moving on for now. I agree though with Trent that it's reasonable to think that something doesn't exist if there's just no evidence for it. I didn't have a ton to disagree with on this chapter. But I do just want to make a note that, so starting in this chapter and then for the rest of the book, or at least for all of part 2, I haven't started part 3 yet. Trent ends each chapter with a dialogue between a theist and an atheist. I don't love that. It's like, when you make your own dialogues, you're always going to come out on top. So I don't love this approach, but I guess, I don't know. It just comes off really apologetic and not super scholarly. Anyway, I'm also in the middle of Eric Hernandez's book. Let me grab that for you right here, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism. And this book does the same thing, where it has conversations between like a theist and a Christian and a non-Christian in Eric's case. And again, look, it's an apologetic book, so okay, I think I've made my point. Chapter 4, did man invent God? So Trent kind of just seeds at the beginning, like, yeah, people have invented gods. And like, obviously, like any religious person is probably going to agree with that because, they don't think that all gods exist. So for all the gods that aren't the God that they believe in, they were made up by men. But then Trent calls into question, are there any good reasons to think that atheism is true just because some gods are indeed made by men? I don't think that atheists are really making this argument in some kind of like knockdown way. I think that they're making this argument in like a cumulative case kind of deal. So if we know of a ton of gods, like if not counting the God that you believe in, you probably believe that every single other God is made up. So maybe evidentially you want to say like, if the trend holds, so it's certainly not knockdown, but part of a cumulative case, maybe. Trent writes, our collective brains fooling us into thinking God exists is one possible story to account for religious belief. But another possible story is that we detect God since he has given us an instinct to find and worship him. Both of these stories explain religious belief, and the atheist would have to provide an additional argument to justify preferring his story over the theistic one. Does the theist here not have to provide evidence that we have some kind of God-honing instinct? I wrote at the bottom of this page, perhaps this comes in a later section. I finished part 2. It's not in part 2. Perhaps it's in part 3, but I don't think it is. And that just kind of strikes me as like a pretty bold claim to make. Like, we have God-honing instincts. I mean, I think that humans have, evolved to be suspicious of our surroundings and stuff like that, but that's not the same thing at all. So I'm pretty skeptical of this claim that we have like God-honing instincts. Trent goes on to critique the I believe in one less God argument than you. I highlighted it in green because I mostly agree with this section. One less God than you, kind of silly. Speaking of silly, this section is called God is a silly idea, therefore he doesn't exist. I don't think I've ever actually like found somebody saying like it's silliness. Now, I have seen people saying like, contradictions and stuff, and Trent does go there in a different section, but moving on, Trent does write defending what mom told us. So he says something to the effect of like, it's not a real argument that like you just believe what your parents believe. Yes, I agree. Like, but again, I don't think that any atheist is saying that that's knockdown proof. I think that the atheist is making a cumulative case. So I think it's like a chip on the scale, if a small chip on the side of atheism. Moving on, God has a magic trick. I thought that this was a weirdly titled section, but there was something that I wanted to respond to here. Trent writes, lack of a causal explanation does not mean that we should give up valid personal explanation. For example, when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a seemingly empty hat, he may not know how he did it, but we certainly know that he did it. Similarly, if God's existence is determined and is demonstrated and his personal intentions explain the world around us, there's no harm in accepting the conclusion that even though we can't provide a step-by-step explanation of how God functions in the universe. So two things about that. The magician pulling the rabbit out of the hat. Like, we have evidence that the magician pulled the rabbit out of the hat. We don't have evidence of the universe being created, right? We have the universe existing. But there's a difference between something being created and existing now. So I want to like hesitate here and be like, well, I don't think it's that simple. And then secondly, lack of a causal explanation absolutely does mean that we should not accept results. Let's go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So this article here is actually about my favorite topic, nominalism. But there's a section down here, arguments against abstract objects and universals. And so the argument here is precisely the thing that Trent points out. They're like, oh, this isn't a reason not to believe it. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy thinks that that is a good reason not to believe it. So one argument against postulating abstract objects is based on Occam's razor. According to this principle, one should not multiply entities beyond necessity. Thus, if one can show that concrete objects can perform theoretical roles usually associated with abstract objects, one should refrain from postulating them. Yep, very good. There's another argument too, so right here, another common and widely discussed argument against abstract objects is an epistemological argument. This argument is grounded in the thought that given that abstract objects are causally inert, it is difficult to understand how we can even have knowledge or reliable belief about them. Admittedly, these arguments do not establish nominalism, but if they work, they show an explanatory lacuna in Platonism. And a lacuna is like an unexplained gap. So PhD philosophers, Trent, seem to think that lack of a causal explanation does mean that we should remain agnostic on the matter. So, yeah, that part was a little frustrating to me too. Okay, that was the end of chapter 4. Moving on to chapter 5. Is God a contradiction? So, this was a interesting chapter. The first note that I made here comes kind of far down. Read the book yourself and, come to your own conclusions, but Trent is talking about a atheistic philosopher, I forget, but his name is Rosenberg. So Rosenberg rejects the idea that our selves really exist and argues that our consciousness is just an illusion. But if our self really is real, then we have good evidence that our mind is not the same thing as our brain. Since there is no reason to think that a person must have a body, and there are reasons to think that our minds are not just our brains, there is no contradiction in God being an immaterial mind that exists without a body. Okay, so Trent's right. It's not a contradiction. But man, Trent just says, yeah, not a contradiction. I'm good to go. Yeah, but I think that the evidential weight of this is just so strong in favor of atheism. Like, to me, this is one of those things where it's just like, yes, it's not literally a contradiction. It's not physically impossible, but I also have no reason to think that minds can exist sans brains. And in fact, I have really good reason to think that minds only exist because of brains. Let me pull up this article published in Frontiers. This article gives a in the summary of the article, it explains that the self is rejected by the vast majority of like experts in the field. So some proponents of the true self can be found within psychology, but its existence is mostly rejected. So experts in the field of psychology mostly reject the concept of self. When the experts are rejecting the concept of self, Trent, come on now. He just says, but if ourselves are real, then we have evidence that our minds and our brains are not the same thing. I just don't think that's the case. And I don't think, and I just think it's weird to be like, yeah, but all the experts think it's not the case. But if it was the case, then I'd be right. Like, okay, all right. And then In this section called All Just versus All Merciful, I just wrote, I think this whole section is question begging. The whole thing kind of goes something like this. I'll just read it. So God's perfect goodness means that he's also infinitely virtuous. God doesn't satisfy some list of virtues. Rather, the morally good behavior we recognize in the world flows from God's perfect nature. So Trent's just saying like, so maybe there is a contradiction here, but there actually isn't, because whatever God is what justice is. And so God is what God is. Therefore, there's no contradiction. Like, we clearly don't think that God, like, is justice, because justice is not charity, for instance. So we have to be very careful with our language here. A lot of theists want to say God is justice, God is mercy. Well, if that's the case, then mercy and justice are the same thing, and charity is the same thing. And I don't think that most theists want to admit that. So I just think that we need to be careful with our language, and I think that this section was question begging, kind of bad. Moving on to chapter 6. Does evil disprove God? So I'm a moral anti-realist, so this whole section is going to be just kind of me nitpicking. So, two bad answers. Trent says there are two extremes that theists should avoid when answering the problem of evil. The first is what I call punting to mystery. Yeah, appealing to mystery is what I think most people probably call it. Awesome, Trent. I agree. Don't just appeal to mystery. But then he appeals to mystery. Watch this. The other extreme is to act as if we know exactly how God allows evil and pretends that there is no mystery. Wait. Don't punt to mystery. But we shouldn't pretend that there is no mystery. So don't punt to mystery, but there is some mystery. So like there's like this happy medium of mystery, maybe, where it's like there's some mystery, just not a whole lot. And like punting to mystery is admitting that there's a lot of mystery, but we should just be, there's only a little mystery. Okay. He admits it is hard to explain. And then he says, my friend and fellow apologist, Jimmy Akin, of whom I am a huge fan, Jimmy Akin says it is a mystery why God allows us to suffer, but there are reasons for our suffering that can help us endure it. Is that not a punt to mystery? I don't know. I just kind of thought that was funny. So the gift of free will, so humans can misuse freedom, which creates the evils that we see in the world. I think that most people would argue that there is free will in heaven, so that doesn't appear to like have to be the case. So I don't think that that's super analogous. Then Trent writes in a section called A Defective Gift. One wonders if Loftus has contemplated what a world without free will would be like. St. Augustine records that a world with free will is better than one without it, in the same way that a world with thriving animals in it is better than a world of lifeless rocks. So here's the thing. Trent just kind of like assumes that we're all on the same page, that like free will definitely exists, but some people say free will is a bad thing. But no, free will does exist and it's a good thing. I'm suggesting that we back up. I don't think that free will really exists, not in the way that Trent Horn thinks it does. And here's the thing. This is like a rather old idea now. Take a look at this paper from 1985. This paper kind of started the whole, not started, but this paper was the first paper to demonstrate that the human mind signals what it's going to do before it actually does it. The brain signals what it's going to do before it does it. Unconscious cerebral initiative and the role of consciousness in voluntary action. This is saying, this 1985 article is saying like 2 seconds before we become consciously aware that we have made a decision, our brain has already made the decision. And if that's the case, like, ooh, that seems like real bad for free will. And this is 1985. Trent Horn's Answering Atheism came out in 2013. And it's not like this was like a weird article in 1985 that nobody else ever referenced. This is hyper-referenced. And then here is something from 2008. So only a few years before. So, Trent Horn was probably writing Answering Atheism in 2011 and 12 and stuff. So only a few years before Trent Horn was writing this. So this article came out. Unconscious determinants of free decisions in the human brain. This article actually is even worse. It talks about how we can now sometimes see a signal in the human brain up to 10 seconds before we actually decide. I suspect that if we had a God machine, we would be able to know everything that happens already because we have a God machine. We live in a deterministic universe. That's just the way that the universe seems to be. And so just Trent's work assuming that free will does exist is, it kind of just irks me. Like I just think that Trent is like way too ambitious in this work. And I think he's ambitious because it's an apologetic work. So anyway, why not heaven now? So one objection to the free will defense is to claim that since no one will sin in heaven, God should have skipped in creating earth and just made heaven. In the words of Belinda Carlisle, a place on earth. However, this objection assumes that God could have made heaven to be exactly like an earth where people have free will and choose only the good. I do not believe that human beings in heaven have free will as we currently understand it. That allows them to choose to do evil. So Trent's admitting that we don't have free will in heaven, which is interesting. But he doesn't mention the 2/3 of angels who chose to do good in heaven. And like, is Trent's point here that like angels have total free will in heaven and humans do not? He doesn't make that perfectly clear here. And I don't know if I fully understand this point, but anyway, I just kind of thought it was weird that he didn't even bring up the angels. Anyway, that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 is, does pointless suffering disprove God? Again, as somebody who isn't a moral realist, I don't know if I have a huge, wager on this race, but there was one thing that I wanted to point out. Trent says God uses the suffering in our lives because he desires the greater good that can come from such suffering. Does that sound a little consequentialist to you? Now, I'm not an expert in morality. I kind of find the whole topic to be like a little bit like I say I'm a moral anti-realist and I kind of move on. So I'm not an expert in the church's stance on morality, and I am positive that like the church has never said like, oh, like we're like virtue ethics is the way to go. Although I think that's where the church kind of leans. But consequentialism has been, in no uncertain terms, decried by Catholics and the Catholic Church. Here's an article by somebody from, Jason Blakey is a professor of political science, and he wrote an article for Church Life Journal, a journal of the McGrath Institute for Church Life. So this is a Catholic thing, and he refers to consequentialism as a plague that is affecting cafeteria Catholics. So real Catholics aren't sick with consequentialism. So I just found it pretty weird that Trent was being pretty staunchly consequentialist right here, saying that God uses the suffering in our lives because greater good comes out of it. So like, is God allowed to do that and we are not, or something? I'm not really sure where Trent was going with that. I just thought that was kind of weird. I didn't have many notes here. One more note: if God performed a miracle every time someone was in danger, then we could never be compassionate and help others, which I think is one reason why God made us. So that's actually not my stance. I actually think that if we lived in a universe that was like more obviously like God infused, I can imagine a universe full of like near misses where like there was a miracle every single time that something bad happened, but that miracle was my intervention. So imagine that every single time that I witness a car accident, I'm actually able to like step in at the last moment and like pull, the mother with her young children out of the way of the car, and the car comes this close to like smashing them, but I'm able to save them. Imagine that when the building is about to collapse on me, somebody pushes me out of the way. I can imagine a world in which we have all of these virtues like courage and bravery and charity and stuff like that, but nothing bad actually happens. Like, that's totally possible. That doesn't seem metaphysically impossible to me. So this little claim by Trent here, I just kind of thought was like a little like, well, that's not obvious to me. Not obvious to me. And that's the end of part 2. So I had my fair share of disagreements with Trent. And the whole point of part 2 was, look, atheism is false. So he's answering atheism. He's saying, no, atheism is not true. I'm not convinced that atheism is not true. You knew that going into this. I'm an agnostic. So far, part 2 hasn't been able to change my mind, though it is possible that part 3 is going to increase my credence that there is a God. I don't know if I'm optimistic that will happen, because this style of book generally just rubs me the wrong way, the very apologetic books. I think something more scholarly is going to be more likely to change my mind, but I do look forward to finding out. I'm going to read part 3 in its entirety, And then I'm going to decide whether I want to make one video out of it or multiple. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, everybody.